We'll now go to Mr. Richards for 4 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here today. I'm going to follow some similar questions to Mr. Lamoureux. What I'd like to actually ask you to do is just let's take a step back and your current role in administering investigations and penalties that surround the automated dialing devices, or ADADs. I forget the actual acronyms, but ADADs. Tell us, when you get a complaint, walk us through the process that you follow to investigate that complaint. So we're talking obviously outside of an election period, but I would assume there's going to be a similar type of a process set up for complaints during an election. So just walk us through. You get a complaint, what then happens in terms of investigation and proceedings from there, and if you can do it in a fairly short form.
Yes, okay, no problem. So the complaints under the do not call list or the unsolicited telecommunications rules are made to the CRTC. The current operator of the DNCL looks at the complaints and makes sure that all the information has been provided, what we call validation of the complaints. Once the complaint has been validated, we look at that from an enforcement perspective. We look at the rules and whether there's possible alleged violations to those rules. If there are alleged violations, then we look at other parties we have on the day and where it fits in terms of our parties. If it is a very egregious situation, we will look at it right away. If less egregious, we would look at the most egregious files in a more timely manner. Once we've opened an investigation, we start collecting the evidence, and there's tools in our legislation that allows us to do that. And depending on the seriousness of the violation, the compliance history, and a number of factors, we determine the best enforcement measure, and could be a citation, it could be a notice of violation that could or could not include an administrative monetary penalty. Okay, so currently, with outside of the election period, outside of the provisions of this act that are being asked of you if it's to pass, there's no requirement for people who are making these types of calls to provide a script ahead of time to the CRTC or to provide identification to the CRTC. So what's in the act is obviously stronger than what you have currently for the other calls outside of an election, but yet you've still been able to lay charges or notices of violation when you've found instances after investigation.
Obligations that don't exist under the current regime of the National Do Not Call list.
And yet you've still been able to, under your current, outside of an election period, without those kinds of obligations for people, you've still been able to track them down. So what I'm indicating is it will probably make your job easier to have that information. Also, I would just want to ask as well, with the scripts being provided ahead of time and identification provided ahead of time, do you also feel that likely there's a good chance that in many cases people who are violating the rules, maybe aren't doing so intentionally or even knowingly, and by providing the script to the CRTC ahead of time, it actually would enable an opportunity for some of these kinds of calls that voters might find reasons to complain about. Maybe we could eliminate some of those things from happening in the first place by the fact that the script would be provided, so that you would be able to deal with the person and try to alleviate any potential problems. And then secondly, if there is complaints.
But I'm sure there was a good secondly in there. A quick response to Mr. Richards?
Yes, just to clarify, the obligations under Bill C-23 are for the calling service provider or the group in question to retain the script or the transcript of the messages. When the CRTC conducts investigations, we can request those as part of our investigation, but they don't actually provide the script to us in advance. But they do have obligations for making sure that when they enter into these agreements, both parties are aware of the identities and name and address and all that important information that was not a requirement before.
Thank you. Mr. Scott? Back to you, 4 minutes, please.
Great, and thanks so much for indulging me in the last exercise of robo-questioning, as you call it. So now I just wanted to return to what I indicated as my fifth question, which was the whole question of clearly calls to raise funds are covered as voter contact calling, but we also have a new provision in the Act, in the bill, that would say it's section 376.3. This is the exclusion. It says the commercial value of services provided to a registered party for the purpose of soliciting by mail, telephone, or other electronic means monetary contributions is not an election expense as long as the soliciting is directed only towards individuals who have made at least one monetary contribution of $20 or more, and it goes on. So my question is, first of all, very quickly, could you confirm that that kind of calling would indeed be caught as long as it's done during the campaign period? They would have to be registered, right?
Yes, it's covered by the definition of voter contact services, and there's 5 different kinds of situations covered by those types of calls, voter contact calls, and one of the situations is fundraising calls.
Good. And so that's my understanding, but then my concern is the minister has said in the House when concerns have been raised, oh, don't worry, CRTC will deal with this. My concern is, well, CRTC will deal with it within the framework of the new division that you're in charge of, but does that mean that you're going to be going in and determining whether or not people had given $20 or more in the past and the purpose of the call is only for fundraising? Will you be doing that?
The requirement under the legislation is for registration notices to be filed with us where voter contact services take place. And those services would cover fundraising. But the question under the legislation of exemptions under certain fundraising services, which are contained in Section 376, are the purview of the Commissioner.
Exactly. So thank you. There's not much you can do about the actual substance of those calls. The next thing was, this is just a yes or no because I don't want to go into the details of the provisions, but I asked on my 7th question was, is there a gap where there's no specific provision for political parties as groups to have to account for live calls done through internal services? They have to deal for automated dialing, yes, and third parties are covered for live calls, but there's no specific provision that talks about internal services of parties or groups for live calls. I don't find an express section, and I'm wondering if I missed it.
If a political party or a candidate uses their own internal volunteers or their own employees to conduct live calls, they are not required to file a registration notice with the CRTC.
Thank you. That's a rather large exception that has not yet come to the attention of Canadians. Thank you. The last thing is just to follow up on Mr. Lamoureux's question. I think it's just clear, and I'm wondering if you would agree with me that if somebody does not register by definition, and if a party is not involved officially, and somebody sits in the basement and creates their own calling apparatus, as can be done right now, you won't be any the wiser. They won't be part of the registry system. Is that correct?
The proposed legislation requires the CRTC to publish the registration notices within 30 days after the polling date. And so the registration notices that have been filed with us would be publicly available. And presumably, if somebody received calls and doesn't see the registration notice, they would be able to contact us with a complaint.